A small spoon rests on a white plate. On it sit a few glossy black pearls, barely enough to cover the curve of the metal. Somewhere else, a piece of sushi passes by, topped with bright orange beads that glisten under restaurant lights. They look similar. Both are fish eggs. Both come from the sea. And yet one costs more than an entire dinner, while the other feels almost casual, something you order without thinking twice. That contrast is easy to laugh at. It's tempting to shrug and say, it's all hype. But the price difference isn't an accident, and it isn't about taste alone. Because the real question isn't why caviar is expensive. It's what, exactly, we're paying for when two things that look so alike end up living in completely different worlds. Let's get into it right here on Secrets of Simple Things. The confusion. Aren't they basically the same? At first glance, the logic feels airtight. Fish eggs are fish eggs. Salmon roe, tobiko, capelin, tiny spheres that pop and taste like the ocean. So why does one version get a crown and a price tag that makes people whisper? Your brain wants a shortcut here. It sees pearls and decides they must belong to the same logic, the same category, the same price range. That's what our minds do in grocery aisles and on menus. They compress differences into one label, fish eggs, and move on. But this is one of those rare cases where the label hides the real story. Fish roe is a broad term. It simply means ripe eggs of fish. If a fish produces eggs, those eggs can be roe, and they show up everywhere because they're meant to. They're bright, lively, and easy to fold into ordinary food. Caviar lives inside that category, but it occupies a very narrow corner of it. Here's the distinction that matters. All caviar is fish roe, but not all fish roe is caviar. That sentence sounds technical, but it carries weight. Because caviar isn't just a description of what something is. It's a label that bundles together origin, method, time, and tradition. Once you see that, the question changes. You stop asking why one tastes better. You start asking what had to happen before it ever reached the spoon. The reframe. Caviar isn't eggs, it's time. Caviar isn't expensive because it's rare food. Plenty of rare foods are affordable. It's expensive because it represents time that cannot be rushed. When you buy caviar, you're not paying for eggs in the abstract. You're paying for waiting. For years that passed before anything could be harvested. For uncertainty that couldn't be sped up with better machines or clever shortcuts. That idea sounds abstract until you meet the fish behind the label. Because the difference between caviar and ordinary roe begins long before salt ever touches an egg. It begins with a species that refuses to hurry. Origins. The sturgeon problem. Sturgeon are ancient fish. They've been swimming in rivers and seas since long before humans started writing things down. They grow slowly, live long lives, and follow their own schedule. A female sturgeon doesn't produce eggs quickly. In many species, she won't produce roe at all until she's 10, sometimes 15, sometimes even 20 years old. That's not a farming inconvenience. That's a biological boundary. You can't coax a sturgeon into growing faster. You can't ask it to hurry. You can only wait. Modern farms can raise sturgeon more sustainably than the old wild harvests, but they can't change the timeline. Even in clean tanks with careful feeding, the calendar still moves at sturgeon speed. Historically, this is what made caviar rare. Sturgeon lived in specific regions, especially around the Caspian Sea. Harvesting their roe required patience, access, and risk. Over time, caviar became associated with royalty and wealth, not because it was louder or stronger in flavor, but because it was slow. In a world where most food cycles measured months, caviar measured decades, and humans have always treated slow things as valuable. Time versus abundance. Why most roe is affordable. Now compare that with most fish roe you see today. Salmon return to spawn every year. Flying fish reproduce quickly. Herring and capelin exist in massive numbers. Their eggs can be harvested seasonally, predictably, and repeatedly. That abundance changes everything. When supply renews itself quickly, food becomes flexible. Roe turns into an ingredient instead of an event. It gets salted, cured, or served fresh. It becomes something you sprinkle, something you mix, something you enjoy without ceremony. There's nothing lesser about that. It's simply different. Both are fish eggs, but one comes from a biological clock that moves slowly, and the other comes from systems that reset every year. Price follows biology more often than it follows flavor. The process, from egg to delicacy. The difference doesn't stop at the fish. It continues in the handling. Most fish roe is processed simply. Eggs are removed, cleaned, and prepared for eating. Sometimes they're salted. Sometimes they're smoked. Sometimes they're used fresh. The goal is to preserve their brightness, their pop, their boldness. Caviar takes a quieter path. Once harvested, sturgeon eggs are washed with care. They're salted with precision, not to overpower, but to stabilize and reveal. Then they're sorted, by size, by color, by firmness, by how they respond to the slightest pressure. This is not industrial speed. It's selective attention. Each batch is judged not just on appearance, but on how it behaves, how it rolls, how it yields, how it releases its flavor when pressed gently against the roof of the mouth. By the time caviar reaches a tin, it has passed through more waiting and more human judgment than most foods ever will. That effort doesn't scream, it whispers. Taste and roll, centerpiece versus accent. The difference shows up clearly when you taste them. Caviar is subtle. Its flavor is buttery, nutty, restrained. It doesn't explode. It unfolds. The eggs don't crunch. They soften and release a quiet brine that tastes like the ocean remembered, not shouted. Fish roe, by contrast, is bold. Salmon roe bursts. Tobiko pops. The salt is clearer. The sea announces itself immediately. Neither approach is better. They simply play different roles. Caviar is meant to be noticed. It sits at the center of the plate, eaten slowly, often with neutral companions, blini, toast, cream, so nothing distracts from its texture. Roe is meant to participate. It adds color, crunch, and energy. It livens up dishes. It moves. One is a solo instrument. The other is part of the rhythm section. Modern misunderstanding. Why the price feels like a scam. Today, the disconnect feels sharper because we see both side by side. A spoonful of caviar and a roll of sushi live in the same visual language. Small, shiny, spherical. So the price feels arbitrary. But what we're really reacting to isn't greed, it's compression. We're seeing decades of waiting and years of risk condensed into a teaspoon. That kind of value is hard to feel with the eyes alone. Confusion deepens when the word caviar gets stretched. In modern menus and packaging, it's often used loosely. Vegan caviar, caviar-style roe, caviar of the sea. These aren't lies, but they blur the boundary. True caviar has one non-negotiable requirement. It comes from sturgeon. Without that, it may be delicious, but it's something else. And of course, there's status. Humans love foods that signal restraint, foods you don't eat in handfuls. The smaller the portion, the more it seems to imply self-control, sophistication, an audience that knows the rules. That social meaning rides on top of biology and labor like an invisible extra cost. And that brings us to a simple rule that doesn't argue. It just places each one where it belongs. The 5-second rule: luxury or flavor. Here's the 5-second rule, and it's simpler than it sounds. Caviar is luxury. Roe is flavor. If you're looking for elegance, tradition, and subtle complexity, caviar is king. It represents the height of refinement, quiet, deliberate, and meant to be noticed slowly. If you're looking for bold taste, color, and variety, Roe takes the lead. It celebrates accessibility and creativity. It thrives in motion, in contrast, in everyday meals. One stands for the peak of restraint. The other honors the joy of abundance. They aren't competing, they're answering two different desires. What we choose when we choose food. So go back to the spoon on the white plate, the one that looks almost empty. What makes it expensive isn't how much food is there. It's how long the world had to wait for it to exist, and how carefully someone chose not to rush it once it did. Roe doesn't try to be that. Roe doesn't need to whisper. It gets to be bright. It gets to be loud. It gets to be generous. Little bursts of the ocean that fit into everyday life. And maybe that's the hidden lesson sitting under all the price tags. Value isn't always about what something is. It's about what it stands for. Some foods stand for patience and refinement. Others stand for color and joy. The sea offers both. We decide which story we want to taste. And once you notice that, you start seeing it everywhere. Luxury is often just slowness made edible, and every day is often abundance made beautiful. If this helped you see caviar and roe differently, tell me where you've tasted them: sushi, a celebration, or somewhere unexpected. And if you enjoy uncovering the quiet logic hidden inside everyday foods, consider subscribing for the next small secret.